Story 10 of The Human Boy by Eden Phillpotts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 10, Morrant's Half-Sov. Of course, as Steggles said truly, the rummest thing about the whole story of Morrant's half-sov was that he should have one. Morrant, in fact, never got any pocket money in his life, owing to his father being a gentleman farmer. Not that he had nothing. On the contrary, his hampers were certainly the best, except fowls, that ever came to Dunstan's, both for variety and size and fruit. The farming business, Morrant said, was all right from his point of view in the holidays, as the ferreting, both rats and rabbits, was good enough for anything, and 3 packs of hounds met within walking distance of his farm, 1 pack being harriers, which Morrant, by knowing the country well, could run with to a certain extent while they hunted. But Morrant's father was so worried about chemical manures and other farming things, including the prices of wheat, that he didn't see his way to giving Morrant any pocket money. He explained to Morrant once that he was putting every halfpenny he could spare into Morrant's education, so as to save him from having to become a gentleman farmer too when he grew up. But Morrant didn't get a farthing in a general way, so when there arrived a hamper with an envelope in it, and in the envelope a bit of paper, and in the paper a half-sovereign, Morrant was naturally extremely surprised and also pleased. It came from his godfather, who had never taken any notice of Morrant for 13 years, though he was a clergyman. But the previous term Morrant had got a prize for Scripture history, and when that came to his godfather's ears, through Morrant's mother mentioning it in a letter, he wrote and said it was good news, and very unexpected. So he sent the money, and really Morrant was quite bewildered with it, being so utterly unaccustomed to tin, even in the meanest shape. He had a friend by the name of Ferrars who was much more religious than Morrant himself, and knew even more Scripture history, and as a first go-off he asked Ferrars what he ought to do with the money. And Ferrars said that before everything Morrant ought to give a tithe to charity. But when it was explained to Morrant that this meant chucking away a shilling on the poor, he didn't take to the idea an atom. He said his father had set him against giving tithes, not believing in them very much. So Morrant went to Gideon, who knew much more about money than Ferrars, and he said on no account to give a penny away in charity, because Morrant wasn't up in the subject, and might do more harm than good. He also said that in the case of a chap who had never had a half-sovereign in his life before, it was a great question whether he could be expected to give away any. And Morrant said there was no question about it at all, because he wasn't going to. And it made even a difference in his feeling toward Ferrars, for, as he very truly said, a chap who advised him like Ferrars had couldn't be much of a friend. Having decided to keep it, the point was what to do with it. The novelty of the thing staggered him, and knowing he would probably never have another half-sovereign till he grew up, Morrant felt the awful importance of spending it right, because an affair once bought could never be replaced if lost. And, as Bray said, if you get used to a thing, like a watch-chain or a tie-ring, and then lose it, the feeling you get is much worse than if you had never had it at all. I thought about it, too, for Morrant, as he once sent me a brace of rabbits by post, shot by himself in the holidays. I pointed out to him that half a sovereign was a most difficult sum really, being, as it were, not small and not exactly huge, and yet too much to make light of, especially in Morrant's case. If he had got a sovereign, for instance, he might have bought a silver watch-chain to take the place of one which he had. It was made of the hair of his grandmother when she was young, and Morrant didn't much like it, and had often tried to sell it and failed. But 10 bob wouldn't buy a silver chain worth having. Morrant had an idea about braces, and of course he might have bought such braces for the money as would have been seldom seen and very remarkable, but braces are a poor thing to put good money into, and I dissuaded him. There came a change in Morrant after he had the half-sovereign for 4 days and not thought of anything to buy. He began to worry, because time was going on and nothing being done. Fellows gave him many ideas, some of which he took for an hour or two, but always abandoned after a while. Murray told him of a wonderful box of new conjuring tricks which was to be had, and he nearly bought it, but luckily remembered just in time that the new tricks would get old after a while, and some might be guessed and would become useless. Then Parkinson had a remarkably swagger paint box, and knew where Morrant could get another with only 3 paints less for 10 shillings. And Morrant, as near as a toucher, bought that, but happened to remember he couldn't paint, and didn't care in the least about trying to. Corkey minimus said he would run the risk and sell Corkey minor's bat to Morrant for 10 bob, the bat having cost 12. The bat was spliced, and Corkey minor was in Australia, having, luckily for him, sailed to sea just before an exam, owing to a weak lung. If Morrant had played cricket he would certainly have bought the bat, but there again, even though Gideon told him he might easily get 10 and 6 or 11 shillings for the bat next term, he hesitated, and finally Gideon bought the bat himself, as an investment, he said. Well, there was Morrant, stuck with his 10. He wouldn't even change it, because Gideon warned him against that, and told him his father knew men who had made large fortunes simply by not changing gold when they had it. Gideon said there was nothing like never changing gold, so Morrant didn't, only of course there was no good in keeping the money, especially stitched into a private and unknown part of his trousers, as he did, for safety. That half-sovereign acted like a regular cloud on Morrant's mind. And then came an extraordinary day when it acted more like a cloud than ever, owing to its disappearing. Morrant had sewn it, with a needle and thread borrowed from the housekeeper, into a spot at the bottom of his left trouser pocket, and from this spot it mysteriously vanished in the space of 2 hours and a half. He had changed in the dormitory for footer, and left his trousers on his bed at 3 o'clock, returning to them at 4:45. Then, naturally feeling for his half-sovereign, he missed it altogether, and when he examined the spot he found his money had been cut out of the bottom of the pocket with a knife. Very wisely Morrant, seeing what a tremendous thing had happened, did not make a lot of row, but just told about 10 chaps and no more. I was one. My name is Newnes. I said, "The first question is, who knew your secret hiding place?" And Butler said it was a very good question, and showed sense in me. Butler is, of course, high in the 6th. Morrant, on thinking it over, decided that 3 chaps, or 4 at the outside, knew his hiding place. They were Ferrars, Gideon, Fowle, and, Morrant thought, Phipps. So first Butler, who very kindly undertook the affair for Morrant, had Phipps brought up. Phipps stammers even when most calm and collected, and being sent for by Butler caused him so much excitement that Butler made him write down the answers to his questions, and even then Phipps lost his nerve, so that he spelled yes with 2 s's. But he solemnly put down and signed that Morrant had never told him where he kept his half-sovereign, and after he had gone Morrant said that, now he came to think about it, he felt sure Phipps was right. Which reduced the matter to Ferrars, Gideon, and Fowle. The first 2 were set aside by Morrant because Ferrars was, of course, his personal friend, despite the passing coldness about Ferrars' advice, and Gideon, though very keen about money and a great judge of it, was known to be absolutely straight, and had never so much as choused a kid out of a marble. Butler said, "That leaves Fowle, and if you told Fowle you were a little fool." And Morrant said, "We were both Roman Catholics by religion, and that makes a great tie, and though many chaps hate Fowle pretty frightfully, I've never known him try to score off me, except once, when he failed and apologized." And Butler said, "That's all right, I dare say, but he's a little beast and a cur, and also a sneak of the deadliest dye. I don't say he's taken the money, because that's a libel, and he might, I believe, go to law against me. But I do say that only 1 out of 3 people could have taken it, and we know 2 didn't. Therefore, Q.E.D., the other must have." Morrant didn't follow this very clever reasoning on the part of Butler. He only thought that Fowle, being a Roman Catholic, would never rob another; and Butler said he would, because it wasn't like Freemasons, who wouldn't score off one another for the world. He explained that history was simply choked up with examples of Roman Catholics scoring off one another. Butler said, "Religion's quite different. One Buddhist is often known to have done another Buddhist in the eye, so why shouldn't one Roman do another? In fact, they have, thousands of times, as you'll know when you come to read a little history and hear about the Spanish Inquisition. Especially this may have happened, seeing that Fowle is the chap. I tell you candidly that, in my opinion, after a good deal of experience of fellows in general, I take Fowle to be the most likely boy in Merivale to have done it, and knowing him to have had the secret of the private pocket reduces it to a certainty in my mind. Tax him with it suddenly in the night, and you'll see." Morrant slept in the same dormitory with Fowle, and that night the whole room was woke up at some very late hour by the sound of Morrant taxing Fowle. Fowle took a long time to realize what was being said, and when he was awake enough to realize what Morrant was getting at, he showed tremendous indignation, and asked what he had ever done that such a charge should be brought against him, especially at such a time. He reminded Morrant that they were of the same way of thinking in holy affairs, and said he was extremely sick with Morrant, and thought Morrant's religion must be pretty rocky if it allowed him to wake a chap up in the middle of the night and charge him with such a crime. In fact, Fowle went on so that Morrant finally apologized rather humbly. From that day forward began the extraordinary disappearance of coin in general at Dunstan's. Shillings constantly went, and also half-crowns. Gideon got very excited about it, and said watches must be kept and traps set. There was evidently a big robbery going on, and Gideon said if the chaps weren't smart enough to catch the thief, they deserved to lose their tin. Certainly he never lost a penny himself, but despite tremendous precautions, money kept going in small sums. Ferrars was set to watch in the pavilion, I remember, during a football match, and Morrant himself, and even Butler once or twice, also watched. Some chaps thought it was the ground man, but as money also disappeared at school, that showed it couldn't be him. And then there was a theory that it might be a charwoman who came from Merivale twice a week. I believe she was a very good charwoman of her kind, and Ferrars, who is great about helping the poor and so on, told me she was a very deserving woman, with a husband at home who drank, and children too numerous to mention. Which Gideon remembered against the charwoman when the money began to go, and it turned his suspicion towards her, because, as he said, with the state of her home affairs, money must be a great temptation. So a watch was set on her, and a curious thing happened. Being small, I can get into a boot cupboard very easily, and I can also breathe anywhere through a hole bored with a gimlet. This was done to the door of the boot cupboard, and two other rather larger holes were also made for my eyes. Mrs. Gouger, which was the charwoman's name, had to do a lot of work in this room, a large one leading out of the gym, and there on a certain half-holiday I was watching her. She worked jolly hard as far as I could see, and made a good deal of dust and a curious noise through her teeth when she scrubbed, which I thought only men did when they washed horses. But there was nothing suspicious, if you understand me. She didn't touch a coat or anything, though many were hanging against a wall, and the few caps about she merely picked up and hung on the pegs. Then, just before she finished, who should come in but Ferrars, and to my great astonishment Mrs. Gouger curtsied to him as though he had been the housekeeper or the doctor. Ferrars treated her with great loftiness, and evidently knew all about her private affairs. He said, "And how is the child that's got mumps?" And she said it was better. He then gave her some advice about her husband, which I didn't hear, and she blessed him for all his goodness to her, and said God had sent him to a lone struggling woman, and that he would reap 1,000-fold what he had sown. All of which, coming from Mrs. Gouger to Ferrars, seemed very curious to me. Presently he said, "Well, I cannot stop longer. I'm glad the child is better. Keep on at your husband about the pledges. And here's a shilling." Then Mrs. Gouger put the shilling in her pocket and blessed him again, and Ferrars went. That very day young Forrest lost a shilling out of his desk, which doesn't lock, owing to Forrest having taken the lock off to sell to Meadows last term. I told Butler and Gideon what I had seen, and Butler thought it rum, and Gideon said there was more in it than met the eye. Butler said, "Evidently the kid" (Ferrars is a kid from Butler's point of view) "has given the charwoman 10 before, or else she wouldn't have blessed him. Now the question is, how much pocket money does Ferrars get?" And I said, "1 shilling a week." "When does he get it?" "Mondays." Butler said, "Ah," but nothing seemed to strike him, and Gideon thought that Mrs. Gouger ought to be spoken to. This Gideon undertook to do, and the next week he did. What happened was that Mrs. Gouger said all that she had before said to Ferrars about her husband and children, but added that a young gentleman with a most Christian heart had lately interested himself in her misfortunes. Gideon asked if it was a Dunston chap, and Mrs. Gouger answered that she was not at liberty to say. She seemed rather defiant about it, Gideon thought, and, in fact, when he pressed her for the amount the chap gave her, she told Gideon to mind his own business. A watch was still kept, especially on Ferrars, and once Butler did an awfully cunning thing by setting Ferrars to watch and setting another chap to watch Ferrars, if you follow what I mean. The other chap was Butler himself, and the room was a dormitory, but it came out rather awkwardly for Butler, because he sneezed at the very start, and Ferrars got out from under the bed where he had arranged to watch, and found Butler watching behind a coat against the wall. Then they had a row, because Ferrars evidently thought Butler was there to watch him, which he was. The end of the affair came out rather tame in its way, and only shows what awfully peculiar ideas some chaps have. Gideon finally spoke to Slade, the head of the school, and though Slade doesn't like Gideon, owing to his way of making money by usury, yet it was such a serious affair that he listened all through and promised to go to the doctor. Gideon had actually kept an account of all the money stolen, and it amounted now to the tremendous sum of £4 5s. 6d., including Morrant's half-sovereign. Then, after Mr. Dunston knew, we heard one day from Fowle that he had sent for Mrs. Gouger to his study, and that she had been there fully half an hour and come out crying. Fowle had listened as best he could till the doctor's butler had come by and told him to hook it. But he had heard nothing except one remark in the voice of Mrs. Gouger, and that remark was, £4 5 6d., sir, and a godsend if ever money was. Gideon said her mentioning of the exact sum was a very ominous thing for Ferrars, and what was more ominous still happened that evening, for Ferrars wasn't at prep or prayers. There were a number of ideas about as to what it all meant, and Corkey Minimus, who always tries to get among chaps bigger than himself and say clever things, came out with a theory that Mrs. Gouger was Ferrars' mother, and that Ferrars was therefore stealing and making the money over to her. But Butler merely smacked his head when he heard it, and told Corkey Minimus not to be a little ass. Gideon was the only chap who hadn't any idea. He knew Ferrars's great notions about helping the poor and giving tithes to parsons and so on, but he said for a chap to steal money and hand it over to a charwoman in charity was contrary to human nature. All the same, if a thing actually happens, it can't be contrary to human nature. Anyway, after prayers next morning, the doctor stopped the school in chapel and explained everything. He said, "My boys, while it is true that you come to Merivale to be instructed by me and those who labour here among you on my behalf, it is also true that I learn occasionally from those whom I teach. Indeed, new problems are almost as often set by you for my solution as by me for yours, and seldom has a more intricate difficulty confronted me than that which yesterday challenged my attention. There has recently happened among us a mysterious disappearance of coins of the realm. Now, a shilling, a sixpence, a penny piece, if deposited in one spot, will usually remain there until removed by human agency, and the human agent who removes money which belongs to another without that other's sanction is a thief. Boys, briefly, there has been a thief among you, a thief whose moral obliquity has taken such an extraordinary turn, whose views of rectitude have become so distorted, that even my own experience of schoolboy ethics cannot parallel his performance. This lad has looked around him upon the world, and found in it, as we all must find, a vast amount of suffering and privation, of honest toil and of humble heroism, displayed by the lowest among us. He has also observed that Providence is pleased to make wide distinctions between the rich and the poor. He has noted that where one labors for daily bread, another reaps golden harvests without the trouble of putting in the sickle. This extraordinary boy contrasted the position of one of these humble workers with that of those among whom his own lot was thrown here, and he found that whereas that obscure but necessary and excellent person, Mrs. Gouger, she whose duty it is to cleanse, scour, and otherwise purify the disorder produced by our assemblies, he found, I say, that whereas Mrs. Gouger worked extremely hard for sums not considerable, albeit handsome in connection with the nature of her labors, others of the human family, yourselves, were in receipt of weekly allowances of varying amounts, for which you toiled not, neither did you spin. This unhappy lad allowed his mind to brood on the apparent injustice of such an arrangement, and instead of coming to his headmaster for an explanation of this and other problems which arose to puzzle his immature intelligence, permitted himself the immoral, the scandalous, the disgraceful, and horribly mistaken course of righting the balance from his point of view. This could only be effected by defiance of those divine laws which govern all properly constituted bodies of human society. Ferrars—I need not conceal his name any longer—Ferrars broke one commandment in order to obey another. His fatuous argument, as it was elaborated yesterday to me, stands based on error. His crime was the result of the most complicated ignorance and vicious sophism it has ever been my lot to discover in a boy of 12. He did evil that good might come. Ascertaining from the inspired word that charity covereth a multitude of sins, he imagined it must extend to cover that forbidden by the 8th commandment. This commandment he broke no less than 14 times. You ask with horror why? That the domestic affairs of Mrs. Gouger might be ameliorated. He took the pocket money of his colleagues, and with it modified those straits into which poverty and conjugal difficulties have long cast Mrs. Gouger. It was Ferrars's unhappy, and I may say unparalleled, design to go on appropriating the money of his schoolmates until a sum of £5 had been raised and conveyed to Mrs. Gouger. Of this total, with deplorable ingenuity, he had already subtracted from various pockets the sum of £4 5s. 6d. It was his intention to continue these depredations until the entire sum had been collected. But the end has come. The facts have been placed before me, and I confess to you that perhaps never have I been confronted with a problem more peculiar. After a lengthy conversation with those who support me here, and after placing the proposition before a higher tribunal than any which earth has to offer, I have come to a curious decision. I have determined to leave the fate of the boy Ferrars in your hands. This time to-morrow I shall expect Slade, as representing the school, to inform me of your decision, and to-day, contrary to custom, will be a half-holiday, that the school may debate the question and conclude upon it. I would point out that there is no middle course here, in my opinion. Either Ferrars must be forgiven after a public apology to the establishment he has outraged, or he must be expelled. As for the money, if those who have lost it will apply to me between 1 and 2 o'clock to-day, each will have his share again. Well, you may guess what a jaw there was that afternoon, and finally, after hours of talk, Slade decided the point must be arranged by putting papers into a hat. If you drew a cross on the paper, it meant that you wanted Ferrars to be expelled, and if you drew a nought, that meant he was to be let off. You were not bound to say how you voted, and the excitement when the votes were counted was something frightful. Ferrars little knew what was going on. At last the numbers were read out. For expulsion, 124. Against expulsion, 101. And Slade and Bradwell were mad when Slade read them, and said that Merivale was disgraced. But Gideon and Butler and Ashby major and Trelawny said not, and thought it wasn't a case for anything but justice. The Doctor made no remark when he heard what had happened, but I heard him tell the new master, Thompson, a day afterwards, that perhaps the lower school ought not to have been allowed to vote, as small boys would merely have understood that Ferrars had stolen money and nothing else. Their minds, the Doctor said, were not big enough to take in the peculiar nature of the case. But Thompson said he honestly believed the school was perfectly right, and that the subtleties of the case were not for that court, and the Doctor sighed and said it might be so. Anyway, Ferrars went. We never saw him again, and the only cheerful thing about the end of it was that Steggles was badly scored off. You see, he nipped off to the Doctor among the first, and said Ferrars had stolen 10 shillings from him, too, but it happened that Ferrars had kept the most careful account of all the money he had raised for Mrs. Gouger, and the people he had raised it from. But he had never taken a farthing from Steggles. So Steggles was flogged by Mannering in his best form, which shows that things which are frightfully sad in themselves often produce fine results in a roundabout sort of manner. End of Story 10. Story 11 of The Human Boy by Eden Phillpotts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 11, The Buccaneers. Of course, even a kid can get a good idea sometimes, and Mayne, who I was fagging for, said afterwards that the idea was all right. Whether young Bailey or me thort of it first I don't know, but Mayne lent me a book about coursiers and buccaneers and such like people, and he said it was a great life, though not much followed in present times. He was no good for a coursier himself, because the sea always made him dreadfully bad, and besides he was going to be a bushranger some day, being an Australian and well up on it. But he said that Drake and Raleigh and many other men in our English history were buccaneers of the deadliest sort, and had made England what it was. So me and Bailey thort a lot about it, and wished a good deal we could begin that sort of life. Bailey said that in all the books he'd read, if a boy began young, he was generally a supercargo, and went on getting greater and greater slowly. But I thought boys began as cabin boys, and got greater very quickly by rescuing people. But Bailey said that was only in books, and that nobody got on quickly at sea owing to the competition. He did not much think there were any buccaneers left, but Mayne said there were, chiefly off the coast of Africa, and that daring and deadly deeds were done in the Mediterranean to this day. He said the lawlessness there was awful, and that nobody knew what went on along the north side of Africa, in little bays and inlets there, not marked on maps. When Bailey heard that, he took more interest in it, and wished he had been born the son of a pirate instead of a doctor, because he said he should have come easily to it if our fathers had been in that course of life. But when I told Mayne, he said that the best and most splendid pirates had had to overcome great difficulties in their youth, and that it was the pirate who began as a mere boy at school who often made the greatest name. Bailey said he was a pirate at heart, and I said I was too, but not until we read a beautiful book by Stevenson could we see any way to be one really. Then we saw that we must go away from Merivale in secret. In fact, we must fly. And Bailey said it would have to be by night to avoid capture, and Mayne said it was so. But it was a tremendous thing to do, and I asked Bailey about his mother, and Bailey said his mother would blub a good deal at first, but she would live to be proud of him when his name was ringing through England. And I felt the same in a way, because though I have got no mother to blub, I have got an uncle who is my guardian, and he is a lawyer and a Conservative who has tried to get into Parliament and failed. Then me and Bailey talked it out when chaps were asleep in our dormitory, and the thing was what we should really and truly be, because there were coursiers and buccaneers and pirates, and they all had their own peculiar ways. So we asked Mayne which was best, and he said buccaneers. He didn't seem to know exactly what a coursier was, but he told us all about pirates, and he said they kill women and children, and Bailey said he'd rather be a doctor like his father than do that, and I said the same. But a buccaneer is very different, being like Raleigh and Drake, and a buccaneer may have his name ringing through England, but a pirate never has, being rather a beast really. Maine said it was like this. A pirate always thinks of himself and nobody else, but the best sort of buccaneer thinks of himself, of course, but thinks of his country too, and after he has replenished his coffers, he makes his sovereign a present of islands and so on, which are generally called after him, so that his name may never be forgotten. And Bailey said that was the sort he wanted to be, and I said so too. We thanked Maine a great deal, and he said it was a big idea for such kids as us to get, and hoped we were made of the right stuff, and promised not to say a word to a soul. And we finally decided to try it, and Bailey said we must have a plan for action, so we made one. He said we must run away and work gradually by night to the coast and go to Plymouth, and get into the docks and find a ship bound for the north coast of Africa. I asked him what next, and he said very truly that that was enough to begin with, and that by the time we had done that much, many adventures would have fallen to our lot, and we might already be in the way to become buccaneers. And I said I hoped we should make friends at sea, but he said the fewer friends we made, the better buccaneers we should probably be, because it is not a life where you can make friends safely. In fact, no real buccaneer would trust his own brother a yard. And I said we must trust one another at any rate, and Bailey said as far as that went he supposed we must, but he said it reluctantly. The thing was then to save up for the different weapons. Maine said we shouldn't want arms, and that money was all we should require till we got down south. But Bailey felt sure we must at least have pistols, because in books the man armed to the teeth is never molested if people know, but the unarmed man often loses his life for want of a weapon. We had 1 shilling pocket money a week each, and Bailey, getting a birthday, very fortunately, made a whole £1 by it after we had been saving for 3 weeks. So between us we suddenly had £1 6s, and Bailey said it was share and share alike for the present, and always would be, unless some deadly hatred sprang up between us. And I said it never would, but he said it might, and if it did, it would probably be about a girl if books were true, and I larfed because we both have a great contempt for all girls. Well, things went all right, and on a half holiday we managed to get to Merivale and buy pistols. They were 5 shillings and 6pence each, and the man didn't seem to much like selling them. But we got them, and ammunition, 50 rounds each, and Bailey said that would be enough. Maine said they were very good pistols for close work, but advised us never to use them unless in sore straits, and we said we wouldn't. It was the day of the menagerie at Merivale that me and Bailey finally took the great step of going. We had collected a lot of food and studied geography so as to get to Plymouth, and we arranged that we should travel by night and hide by day in the heart of impenetrable woods, which we did. After the menagerie, at a certain point on the way home, we slipped it round a corner, and Thompson didn't see us, and in a brief time we were at the edge of Merivale Woods, free. "Tonight," Bailey said, "we will get across this forest and do 8 or 10 miles along the high road, and so reach Oakshott Woods at dawn. They are on the edge of the moor and quite impenetrable." So we got well into Merivale Woods first, and made a lair of bracken under a fir tree, and we cut off some of the fir tree bark and licked the sap, which is very nourishing and feeding, because we wanted to save our food as much as possible. But we had each a cold sausage and a drink of water. And then night came on, and I felt for the first time that we had done a tremendous deed. "We're fairly started," I said to Bailey. "It's just call over at Merivale now." And he said, "Yes, if the fellows in the upper third could only see us." I said, "It's a small beginning." And he said, "It is, but if things go right, and we are made of the proper stuff for buccaneers, we'll make England ring yet." Then it began to rain rather hard, and I found that a wood isn't really a dry place by night if it rains, and Bailey lighted a match and said it was nearly 9. "That'll mean lights out at Merivale," he said, "but for us it'll mean the beginning of the night." I sneezed just about then, because water from the fir tree was dropping down my neck rather fast, and Bailey said if I was going to get anything the matter with me, I had better go back at once, because no buccaneer ever had a cold, being men of steel and iron. And I said a sneeze was nothing. Then we started very courserly through the wood, and Bailey cocked his pistol, and I asked him kindly to walk in front, feeling a curious sensation when he walked behind me with his pistol cocked. I told him, and he said it was fear, but I said it was caution. Sometimes he whispered, "Cave," and we sunk down and got frightfully dripping in the wet, but nothing happened, and we were getting well on through the woods when Bailey said, "Cave" again, and this time when we got sunk down we distinctly heard a footstep, and Bailey said it was our first adventure, and I said I wished it had come by daylight, because it wants great practice to face adventures in the dark at first. Anyway, the noise got nearer and got louder, and Bailey and me both cocked our pistols, and he said, "Reserve your fire to close range," and I said, "Yes." Then he said, "I see the thing. It's bigger than a beast you would expect in an English wood." And I said, "I have got a sort of feeling it is something out of the menagerie." And he said, "Then it will be a real adventure, and I wish we were up trees." But it was too late, and something went quite close. I saw a red spark, and Bailey said, "Fire," which we did. At least my pistol went off with fearful effect, but Bailey's didn't, and he said afterwards that he'd made the pistol man bitterly rue the day he sold him a treacherous weapon. But after I fired we heard a human voice, and it said, "Hell." Then it said other fearful words, which Bailey said we ought to remember, because they were buccaneering words, curiously enough. And then the man dashed towards us, which showed I had not slain him, or even hit him in a vital spot, and we fled. And soon we found that we had distanced him, although we had a squeak for it. "He was a keeper," said Bailey, "and he will think we were poachers, and raise a hue and cry. We must keep on and get into Oakshott Woods, or we shall very likely have to yield to superior force." After this excitement I got a curious feeling in my stomach, and telling Bailey, he said it was either hunger or fear, and I said it was hunger. But Bailey said, seeing what a heavy meal we had made with sausage and bread and turpentine juice only 2 hours before, that it was fear. I said if he thought so he'd better go on without me, as I hadn't taken to this course of life to be cheeked by him. And he said he was leader of the gang, and I was the gang, and the first thing was to learn to obey orders. And then I got rather cross with Bailey, and asked him who he thought he was to give me orders, and reminded him my pistol could go off anyway, which was more than his could. This worried him a good deal, because, of course, the man whose pistol went off had the best of it. Then he said that it was no good having a quarrel between ourselves while we were not yet out of danger. He also said that he believed we might venture to take 1 hour's sleep to strengthen us before getting on to Oakshott, and I said yes, but thought that one of us ought to watch while the other slept. Bailey said he would watch first, and he said also that we might get to the woodman's hut in the middle of Merivale Woods if we kept on past a dead fir tree with its stem white, because all the bark was off, which we did, because the moon was now shining very brightly, and the rain had stopped. The cold was also frightful, and my teeth chattered once or twice, but I broke sticks and things to attract Bailey, because if he had heard my teeth he would have said it was fear again. Once a bough jumped back and hit Bailey a frightful smack in the face, and I was glad, and he said he rather thought his eye was done for, and he said it didn't much matter if it was, so long as he had one good eye to see with, because most buccaneers lost an eye sooner or later, though generally with a stroke from a cutlass. We found the hut, and there was some dry fern in it, and we lighted a candle end we had, and took off our boots and wrung out our socks, and each had half a currant dumpling. Then Bailey looked at his watch and said I might turn in for half an hour. Then he would wake me and turn in for half an hour himself. He went on guard with another candle end, and advised me to draw my pistol and sleep with it cocked under my head. But I said I never heard of such a dangerous thing as that being done, and kept my pistol ready cocked near my hand. I didn't fall off to sleep, as I expected, owing to anxiety as to our fate, but I shut my eyes and thought a great deal, and after my eyes had been shut some time, I opened one a little, and was greatly surprised to see Bailey coming towards me stealthily. He had his pistol in his hand, and first I had a horrible thought he wanted to kill me, so that he might have all our food and money. And then I felt sure he was coming to change pistols, so that he might have the one that went off. This made me get in a frightful wax with him, because I saw he was very unreliable and not really as much of a chum as I had thought. So I waited until I saw him stretch out his hand for my pistol, and then I leapt at his throat in a very ferocious way that much surprised him. I also said "hell," like the keeper had. It must have been a solemn sight by the light of the candle end when we began to fight tooth and nail for the pistol which could go off. We were both desperate, and it was really a battle to decide which should be the leader of the enterprise and which should be merely the gang. Then, while we wrestled and strained every nerve, a curious thing happened, for we fell against the candle end, stuck on the top of a stick, and the candle end fell against the side of the hut, and the hut, being made of wood, with walls of dried heather, was very inflammable, and caught fire almost immediately. And then Bailey said we must agree to settle our dispute later on, and fly at once. So we each took our own pistol, and were just going to leave the scene, when to our great horror we heard voices, and among them the voices of Browne and Manwaring, who were, of course, house-masters at Merivale. Exhausted though we were, me and Bailey made a terrible effort to escape, and I think we might have done so even then, but owing to the moon and 2 other men who were with Mainwaring, we could not reach an impenetrable part of the wood, and finally Mainwaring caught me and a man caught Bailey, and they dragged us into the light of the blazing ruins of the hut, and we found out that Browne and Mainwaring had come after us like beastly bloodhounds, and had met the keeper, who told them he had been fired upon, and then the unfortunate burning of the hut had directed their steps towards us. And it's a solemn lesson in a way, showing what risks it is for buccaneers to fall out among themselves at critical moments. Of course we had to walk back merely as prisoners of Mainwaring, but Bailey told me not to answer questions, and rather let them cut our tongues out than know the truth. So they didn't get anything out of us, and when we got back at 2 o'clock in the morning, Dunstan was up to meet us, and by that time, what with cold and bruises and the failure of the scheme, I wasn't equal to defying Dunstan, and merely said we wanted to change our course of life for something different, and had started to do so, and I also said that burning the hut was an accident which might have happened to anybody, and Bailey said the same. Then Dr. Dunstan sent for the matron, and we had brandy and water and a hot bath, which was very refreshing to me, but Bailey said bitterly, when he was in it, that he had thought that morning never to have had a bath again. He also said we should be put in separate bedrooms that night, and that if either of us got an opportunity to escape, it was his duty to rescue the other. But I said I didn't want to escape, being frightfully sleepy and exhausted, and I said that if he escaped he needn't trouble to rescue me, because if I returned again to being a buccaneer, it certainly wouldn't be with him. I didn't see any more of him until next day. Then we were taken in like prisoners of war before the school, and Dr. Dunstan lectured upon us as if we were beasts of prey, and he said that a course of faulty literature was to blame for our running away, and said that the school library must be reformed. But he never knew the great truth, because he said we were only running away to sea because of the fascination of the ocean to the British character, when really it was to be buccaneers and the terror of the Mediterranean. Maine showed us all the points we had done wrong afterwards, and he said the way we had fought for the best pistol was very interesting to him, and a great warning not to trust in your fellow creatures. And after he had lectured upon us, Dr. Dunstan flogged me and Bailey in public, which showed the stuff we were made of, because Though Bailey gets very red when flogged, he has never been known to shed a tear; and I get very white, curiously enough, but I have never been known to shed a tear either. End of Project Gutenberg's The Human Boy, by Eden Phillpotts.